We're in Austin for Consensus with Genzio, and today I'm with Tarun.
Hey, what's up?
I want to start by understanding like how you got into the industry because there were so many topics that I feel like I could touch. Yeah, let's just start there.
Yeah, for sure. So basically, in 2010, 2011, I worked in hardware on building ASICs, but not for Bitcoin mining, for a totally different use case for a physics thing. And that was around the time that we were building chips. We would send out orders to manufacturers, and once we gave out this my old work gave out this $25 million chip order, and our suppliers all ghosted us for 6 months, and then came back later and were like, "Hey, we'll give you a 10% discount." And
Okay.
obviously, my work was like, "What the fuck is happening?" Basically, we found out that was like one of the first Bitcoin ASIC miners, like building custom hardware for mining, to come out, and that sort of was when I was like, "Wow, this is crazy! People are building hardware. I'm just gonna go mine some before it gets too hard." And yeah, I mined a bunch of Bitcoin, sold it all at the bottom in 2013. So it
Oh.
wasn't exactly the resounding success then. But I kind of didn't totally believe everything within crypto worked the way that was claimed in kind of the early white papers. But I think in 2015 and 2016, that was when a lot of the sort of more rigorous research that gave a lot more confidence that why these systems should work the way they do and like how you can improve them kind of came out. And those research papers are sort of what really sent me down the rabbit hole, where I was reading them and I would be like, this is really cool, awesome cryptography that people are working on. I also think the financial part seems to make no sense yet, and like this is like the early 2015, 2016 papers, but the way these systems work, now it's starting to make sense to me. And you know, during the 2017 boom, I spent a lot of time reading both white papers and research papers, and in the process, I sort of found these kind of financial risk problems within how people construct these systems are sort of the thing that I was most interested in. And so,
What from your background drove your interest?
yeah, so I studied math and physics, and then I was about to do a PhD that I didn't start, and then I went and worked in hardware. I'd worked in hardware development. I'd worked in a lot of sort of I'd worked in high frequency trading. I'd also worked in sort of things that use statistical algorithms in high performance computing environments for a long time, for like 8 or 9 years before I really got into crypto. And because of that, I was always interested in the once the systems are live, how do you optimize them part of the world versus like how do you go from nothing to something? That sort of was sort of the thing that kind of naturally stood out. I think I certainly got kind of lucky that in the early days of DeFi in 2018 and 2019, you know, I had spent a lot of time analyzing on-chain data, which at that time was no one was doing it, and was convinced that hey, like some of the things people are doing on chain, there must be some principled reason they work, not just like it couldn't just, even though the idea seems kind of random, like the idea that people are putting in millions of dollars and the system is staying stable was something that really kind of captivated me. So yeah, long story short, my background is sort of like mixed from, if you went to, I remember once one of my colleagues looked at the books on my shelf, and like, we shared an office, and like you had his books and my books. He's like, look at my books. You look at my books, you know exactly what I study. I look at your books, I have no clue what you study. It could be like one of five fields, and it doesn't seem like you're like deep in any one of them. I think like one interesting thing about crypto to me is that it's a very interdisciplinary field. I don't think it's not just understanding, from the technical side, it's not just like understanding pure cryptography. It's not just understanding distributed systems. It's not just understanding the kind of optimization and math stuff. You kind of have to move between the different fields to have a good holistic picture, especially when working on research.
And even like looking at the user behavior and understanding how people might react to stuff. I think there's like so many layers to it. So, 2017, you're like looking at DeFi and you see gaps in a space.
Yeah, so 2017 actually, the thing that really was kind of got me spending my nights and weekends trying to understand the stuff was there were a lot of papers that came out for new proof of stake networks. So, everything from like Algorand, Tezos, Cosmos, Polkadot. all of these networks would have these white papers that would spend a lot of excruciating detail talking about, what particular signature scheme they're going to use, what type of, how their consensus algorithm works, how they kind of are different in some kind of very nuanced implementation ways. But then when you reread them and you would think about the financial aspects, they're like, well, we'll just use almost the same tokenomics model as Bitcoin. And there's sort of something intrinsically different between proof of stake assets versus proof of work assets, in the sense that, if I think about a proof of stake network, why do I participate in the network? The network is giving me yield in its native token. But it's also true that yield is directly competing with applications. So, if I see an application on Ethereum that's offering 20% yield, and I see a proof of stake, the network offering 7% yield, that should sort of mean that if people are rational, they migrate their assets from being staked to the application. And in some sense, that's a different security model than proof of work, where the yield that the network is offering is not collateralized by itself, right? I have to commit energy, or I have to commit some resource for a long time to earn the proof of work asset. So I just was sort of confused as to, how the security models were different between proof of stake and proof of work. And I went down this rabbit hole of like writing simulations and stress tests to try to break these inflation models, to try to show these types of attacks that I'm talking about, where basically you can imagine some application offers more yield for a long time than the underlying blockchain. People migrate all their stake out, and then someone attacks the base network. And so, yeah, I'd basically written this kind of like software for doing that. And I showed all these people who had started L1s. I was like, hey, here's like some reason the current model in your paper doesn't work. And they were like, oh, do you want a job? And at that time, I was like, everyone who's in ICOs seems kind of sketchy. So like, I don't know if I'd want to work for any of them. But I was like, I'll do some consulting. And so I did some consulting. And then at some point I was like, I am making as much money doing this than I am working in trading, so I'm gonna just leave. And so that led me to start my company. Effectively, was basically like I started consulting for different people about this type of these economic security type of things.
Gauntlet.
This is Gauntlet.
Yeah.
It started as me being a one person consultancy, and then kind of grew. So the DeFi stuff happened probably after Gauntlet actually started. I had the very lucky fortune of working in this amazing co-working space in New York that was where like I feel like all of New York cryptocurrency talent somehow ended up in this office, whether it was working there or whether they're at events at some point. So MakerDAO used to run, when Makers started, they used to run a meetup called DeFi NYC. They used to be in this office. And in fact, in November 2018, Uniswap was kind of launched. Their launch party for like the V1 was like basically this 20-person meetup at this office. So I just happened to be working there, and I went to the talk, and that sort of is what led me down the rabbit hole of like, why should this thing work? It sort of seems like there should be some sort of adverse selection costs that is not included. And yeah, it just led to a whole line of research in that world.
Did you ever have a point of view that ended up not aligning, like something else happened that surprised you within the DeFi space? So an example would be you expected something or you advised in a certain direction, but then the market shifts or something happens that changes everything. So not necessarily you being wrong, but something sort of like switching gears because something happened.
I think an interesting observation from that era, so the 2017, 2018 era, is, everyone who was starting a new network who like raised money in ICO was really worried about network security from the perspective of people doing these types of forking attacks. So nothing at stake attacks, long range attacks that involve me aggregating a bunch of stake, causing a fork, and that fork being kind of like malicious to everyone else. In practice, we've seen basically zero of any such attack. Like we barely see any slashing events, let alone people try to attack. But the interesting thing is that DeFi, on the other hand, is much more nihilistic in the sense that we have seen tons of these attacks where one protocol takes sort of effectively attacks another one by either offering yield in a certain way, sort of making it easier to manipulate an oracle, do all of these attacks that people at the base layer were worried about and spent all this time and effort on, but the application layers where they actually took place. So I think that's actually kind of one of these funny things where, from a security standpoint, you can oftentimes worry about the right attack for the wrong user, if that makes sense. And like that was just something that I observed from that era to now. If I look backwards on it, is that a lot of these attacks, like bridge hacks and oracle manipulation attacks, they all took place one layer above the proof of stake protocol. And I think there's a sense in which a lot of proof of stake protocols do share one thing in common with proof of work protocols, which is, yes, you're not really collateralized by the amount of energy you're using. You're collateralized by the virtual asset itself, but you still have to run the hardware, and there's some kind of excess cost to actually having to have your infrastructure be alive and running and kind of optimized that inevitably makes it much harder to do an attack. Versus in DeFi, it's much more like, I see a particular protocol that's vulnerable, I send a bunch of transactions, and I can do the attack without thinking. There's a lot lower barrier to entry. So I think that's a thing that I think is you always have to keep in mind when thinking about security in this space is, are you thinking about the right threat model at the right time? And I think a lot of the layer ones, arguably rightfully so, there had been attacked networks in the past, maybe thought about the problems that didn't affect them, but affected the things building on top of them.
Do you think like some of these founders and even like people that are on the technical side in this industry, like we tend to get like so immersed? Do you think they don't do the macro view, like looking from above enough, and that's why like perhaps like having advisory maybe to save them at some point?
Yeah, and I think you could argue that someone, if I think about Solana as a network, they made certain trade-offs in how they designed the network, but their kind of thesis is that the most important user of the network is the user submitting transactions. I think if I can compare that to Ethereum, or I compare that to other proof of stake networks, they view users who are submitting transactions as well as validators and node operators as equally important users. In Solana's case, they kind of don't care about the node operators, right? They're like, we'll make your requirements for running a node harder and harder and harder, and like you have to eat it. But I think the interesting thing is, by having that slightly different philosophy, you got totally different architectural choices and optimizations, and in some ways that helped the macro for things creating meme coins very easily, right? So yeah, I think there's a lot of input that people don't get because they're so stuck in their project and their ecosystem that like they don't get to zoom out and see. So that's definitely, I think, the value for a lot of people from
and also like the volume of stuff. I guess the more stuff you see and throughout the years, you have this you develop this sixth sense to see things before they even happen. Is there something that to you is missing, and it's very obvious within the DeFi space?
I mean, I think the one kind of thing that it's still kind of a sad thing in some ways is just like self-custody for DeFi is just never it's very hard to imagine a large portion of the population doing it.
Yeah.
Which kind of sucks, right? Like for meme coins, people don't really care. They're fine with self-custody. But for DeFi, you have to like think a lot more, right? Like, oh, like, do I move all my liquidity provisioning from this protocol because there's an attack or some type of, like you have to be much more responsive, and it's like hard to make a kind of easy user UX for that. Not that it's impossible, but I think the one thing that still kind of, I still feel like hasn't happened is we haven't been able to get the UX of using DeFi to feel and safe, and I'm including safety in that. Like, hey, my funds are automatically moved when there's a hack, but like I can put all these kind of covenants and rules around it. There's a lot of automation around that versus like me manually sending like 500 transactions to you know what I mean? Like the we haven't found the right complexity versus accuracy versus safety trade-off for DeFi. Whereas I think for things like meme coins, because it's just easy. There's no security stuff you have to think about. There's no, doing the automation for that's easy.
I definitely agree. Like I feel I use different types of ways of storing different types of money, if you want to put it that way. And I there's different types of pain points all across, and it takes like if you don't work with money full time, and you have to like sit down and go like manage your money, and if you have to do that often, and then if it's on a place that might not be as secure as some other place where you could move it, and then there's like all these security layers. For example, like recently I had like an issue with arguably Coinbase security is so good that you might lock yourself out.
Yeah.
And to me, like that is something that not even just in crypto, I feel like all things around security probably need a decent upgrade. I don't know what that looks like, but if someone is working on that, I'm like, yes, like keep going. Bring it back to what you were saying. What do you think that would look like? Like if someone was to bring that to life, like a new DeFi that the standard person, like my mom has crypto, but I manage my mom's crypto. She doesn't trust herself. She did in the beginning, but now like she just doesn't. She doesn't book her own flights. She doesn't trust herself online. She doesn't even want to go on a laptop. Having like for someone like her, for example, that owns crypto, and for her to manage her own stuff, what would need to be in place?
I'm going to take a slight tangent before answering this exactly, which is, I think the midwit meme in crypto has been, crypto and AI will somehow find a way to merge, and it'll be some type of like infrastructure thing that, that crypto decentralizes existing AI networks. I think most of those things are full of shit, but I do think that the interesting thing is actually doing a lot of the automation for security and for transaction execution and executing things on your behalf via some form of AI, but with security features. Because the problem right now is like jailbreaking most of the AI things is quite easy. I would say what I mean by that is like if I think about Telegram bots that like I use to trade or automate my strategies, they're giving you as close to a good UX as possible. But imagine if I could give them directions that are not myopic. Myopic in the sense that most Telegram bots, you say, okay, like I want to buy Pepe. I don't care what chain it gets bought on. Just give me 100 Pepe. And then you open your wallet 10 minutes later and you see that you have 98 Pepe on Arbitrum and 2 on Optimism or something, right? That's a single task, right? That's like a short-sighted single task. But imagine I wanted to just give a long-term goal. I say, hey, I actually want to earn yield across these 3 chains only in these types of protocols, and I automatically approve up to this amount of transfer. So you kind of imagine you could like set these high level things, and then people are sort of competing to optimize your portfolio. So I think that's the dream of all this intent stuff. Whenever people say intents, they like want to get to the point that other people can execute transactions on your behalf, and they earn some fee for that. But those transactions have to satisfy some constraints that you put on them. And as they're competing, they can do longer and longer term tasks for you. So like that task I just said might be like 3-month task, like earn me 5% yield in 3 months. I don't care how, but you have to use these with these restrictions. Like you can't do any transaction more than X%, stuff like that. And that level of automation still doesn't exist, right? That the automation of like I can give a long-term task that gets automatically executed, the transactions get generated, they get submitted, ... right? I still have to do this myopic thing where like even in the Telegram bot I'm sitting and pressing a button 10 times, right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Like I think like that layer of like I don't have to think about it, if you could get to that, that's like the ideal end state.
Yeah.
Oh, and self-custody, because the centralized entities offer you this type of stuff, right?
Yeah. The issue I see with using AI is trust. I think a lot of people don't trust AI.
For sure.
And like what you don't understand.
They shouldn't either. That's what I meant. Like there's tons of exploits. In fact, the security surface for AI is much worse than crypto. So
like because imagine like you have a ton of option, right? You're gonna pick which AI is gonna manage your money or like do some sort of trade, I don't know. To choose between your options, you could read what they say it is, but if you really want to make a good option that allows you to sleep at night, you really have to understand how it actually works and understand and be like perhaps a little bit technical or get some kind of advisory. So I do say like introducing AI to it, my perspective wouldn't necessarily help because a lot of, at least currently in society, there's a lot of people that are like they don't trust it.
And that's totally fine, right? They can go sit and manually submit every transaction and sign 500 times a day, right? Like, my point is like you should have the option to use which one you want, right?
Yeah.
And instead, I've just generally observed most people, especially investors, they just like love investing in things that are like decentralized training, which is like that's very unlikely to happen for like hardware limitation reasons, not for because people just don't care about the kind of like provenance and safety in that use case versus like, oh, can I do kind of something that's like for the end user versus like infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's slowly happening, like this flip where like people are actually trying to use these tools to make automation better. So I'm not just going to call it AI per se. I just mean some sets of techniques for automation so that I don't have to think about something, but I can self-custody and I get basically the same rates as the centralized entities.
Yeah.
Right? That's like the sweet spot that we're missing.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. And then like from adoption perspective, for people to start using more like DeFi protocols, do you think it's gonna come more strongly out of need from, say, like countries that like, like the government is more, not as friendly? Or do you think it's gonna come from cities that are more developed, like big capitals?
Yeah, so I was talking to an early Tether employee yesterday, and I told them and they were like, "What's the last time you used Tether?" And I said, "Well, when I went to Turkey, because I could pay with Tether on Tron almost anywhere." And I don't think I used Tron. Maybe I did indirectly once, but I used Tron for real IRL in Turkey, and it was wild to me. It was like easier than paying with credit card, which I could never say. I bought lunch, I bought coffee. It was like all the shit in 2013 everyone was telling you like you would use crypto or Bitcoin or whatever for, like you were actually doing that, which I can't believe it took 10 years for me to ever do that. But the point is, like, I feel like there are places in the world that are just have where people just hate their local currency so much, and they're just on the cusp of the like electronification of payments, and those places seem to be where like it feels like there's real users who are not degen gamblers. Mm-hmm. And so I still believe in the like Nigeria and Turkey thesis. I mean, Phantom being like number one in Nigeria's app store is like itself of kind of. I mean, I'm that statistic is a little. I'm sure there is some incentivized farming of that to go up, but even then, it's still crazy. I really do think like those parts of the world will have higher adoption initially. I don't know about this U.S. institution stuff. I think like they kind of are interested, but they're going to be very like delicate and slow. I'm looking at someone who I think agrees with me.
How do you think, like, with the elections coming and stuff, like, how do you think it's going to impact crypto?
It's interesting that the Democrats have suddenly flipped very quickly. So I should give some disclaimer. I'm from the home state of Biden. In fact, he's from my hometown. So I've my parents are generally always pissed off when he comes home because all the streets are blocked. But I've kind of never I find this like partisan part kind of funny of like how all these people in crypto are suddenly like single issue voters. But I do think it's kind of interesting that there was just such a last minute flip. Like what really caused it? Like there must have been some polling catalyst thing that led to this flip. Yeah, I know a bunch of people actually met people at the White House like in the last couple of weeks about crypto in particular. It's very clear that there's this huge about face happening right now. I'm just not sure that like unlocks real usage. And maybe this is just because I've been in crypto for a long time, but ETFs just they're not that interesting, right? Like fine, number goes up. Who gives a shit, right? That's like that wasn't really the interesting part about crypto in general, right? It's like the self-custody part, the actual ability to like do whatever you want with your assets, the idea that you can write like 5 lines of code and do all the stuff that you could never do in traditional finance. And like, yeah, it just doesn't quite, ETFs don't inspire that type of thing. But, you know, it's obviously good for interests, right? And the number go up. But I don't feel like that's the real usage. Whereas like you go to Turkey or Nigeria and you're like, that is real usage. And people want stable coins. Like there's no doubt that that's like the number one use case everywhere.
I agree. I could talk with you for hours. Like this is like really interesting to me. But we have to wrap it up. Where can people find you?
Twitter, my name, Tarun Chitra, or Farcaster. Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks.